Greetings, netizens of YouTube. It has come to my attention that groupthink and witch hunts are omnipresent in online communities. This is indisputable, and many of us would accept that these ignorant tendencies are an unfortunate part of human nature. What is less clear is why organised witch hunts are considered acceptable by any of those taking part, even more so when the entire exercise is a charade. I'm of course referring to the case of Sarah Nyberg, an individual who stood accused of paedophilia and has faced harassment on Twitter. But hold your horses before you begin agreeing with me vigorously or are feeling offended by my words. I'm going to put together a pretty solid case, the main charges being dishonesty and hypocrisy. If you please, my opening gambit.
Because it wasn't sufficiently scandalous that I lost my virginity in an interracial fivesome with a drag queen.
That's not enough?
No, so I started
How
bringing...
old were you?
I started bringing, I don't know, like 13, maybe 12,
13?
13?
Drag
12
queen,
or 13,
interracial
drag queen
fivesome?
fivesome? Yeah, it was great.
That's the first one?
Yeah.
Oh yes, you understood correctly. During his recent appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast, Milo Yiannopoulos stated that he first had sex when he was 12 or 13 years old with an adult drag queen and said that he thought this was perfectly okay. This is the right-wing Breitbart journalist who thought it was perfectly okay to lead the witch hunt against Sarah Nyberg, an individual alleged to have paedophilic fantasies who reportedly took a picture of her clothed 8-year-old cousin. Let's begin with these claims.
I exposed this pedophile, she was backed up, and all the social justice warriors doubled down and protected her because she was, on message, basically. She had the right politics, so they stuck up for a kiddie fiddler. This is the state of the modern left.
But rather than focus on that case and his distasteful role in hate mob activities, or to refute Milo's claims that the left are allegedly behind some kind of conspiracy to legalise paedophilia, I'm going to look at the double standards of those that claim to be against paedophilia. I think it's important to examine Milo's personal beliefs as he is lecturing us on the subject. But it's more pertinent to look at the convictions of those involved in the campaign, including Gamergate and associated causes which are of a libertarian or classical liberal persuasion. Many in the libertarian tradition advocate that the consumption of child pornography should be allowed on the basis that to prevent it would be censorship or involve government regulation of a free market, in this case the internet. The position is that as long as the individual in question wasn't the one who filmed the child pornography and or hurt a child in the process, it can be tolerated. The emphasis is on personal freedom and that of minimizing the role of government in every sphere. But sometimes it goes further than this. Consider this article from January 2012, which appeared on the libertarian-leaning The Objective Standard website. Some libertarians argue that children should be free to have sex with adults. Although the LP platform says consenting adults should be free to choose their own sexual practices and personal relationships, Mary Ruwart, an author featured prominently by advocates for self-government and a leading contender for the 2008 LP presidential ticket, claims that restriction is too narrow. Regarding the question of child pornography, she writes in her book on libertarianism, "Children who willingly participate in sexual acts have the right to make that decision." Of course, Ruwart's view is very likely a minority one within libertarianism. Nevertheless, I think it's valid to point out that these viewpoints exist within libertarianism, although for obvious reasons people will not state such opinions in public. Perhaps a comment from a libertarian website and statement from a senior member of the Libertarian Party in the US doesn't suffice. And didn't I mention classical liberals? The Ludwig von Mises Institute, an influential body that advocates classical liberal and libertarian principles, have an essay up on their website called The Arbitrariness of Ages of Majority. A few things I'd like to make clear. Firstly, this document is worth a read, if for no other reason than to examine the mindset of libertarian ideologues. Link in the description. Secondly, you can clearly see that Sargon's friend Justicar lifted many of his ideas in support of paedophilia from this page. This piece is the reason he was mumbling incoherently about how arbitrary the age of consent was in that series of videos. I wonder what he thought about the Nyberg campaign. Without openly advocating adult sex with children or legalizing the usage of child pornography, the piece attempts to debunk all the evidence proving the harm of such activities while building a case in defense of both. In some cases, a young person may consider the sex to have been loving and consensual, but is told by the government that he was manipulated and victimized. The government is to blame, not the paedophile. One of the main arguments for modern statutory rape laws was that teenage pregnancies expanded the welfare roles. However, putting the older partner in prison could actually prevent him from providing for his child. So, if the kiddie fiddler manages to get a pubescent girl pregnant, give him a slap on the wrist and leave it at that. The truth of the assumptions behind the exploitation theory of child sexuality, which hold that all prepubescent children are asexual by nature and therefore only engage in sex when they are pressured or forced to do so. That theory is central to justifying government intervention, because government regulations in general tend to be of a uniform, one-size-fits-all nature. So yes, for everybody with an unhealthy interest in prepubescent children, if preteens are having sex with an adult, it might be because they want to, rather than because an adult is exploiting them, apparently. However, the piece does a great job in debunking Milo by claiming that it is the left that is stopping rational discussion on issues such as child porn, whereas Milo and his allies are claiming that it is the left that wants to legalize child porn. But it doesn't end there. Even conservatives such as former political science professor at the University of Calgary, Tom Falnagan, opined in November 2009, what's wrong with child pornography, in the sense that they are just pictures? Hell, even Richard Dawkins thinks that a little bit of touchy-feely with the kids is okie dokie. But the new online libertarians and classical liberals are a different kettle of fish than their elders, who pontificated about sexual politics through an interest in philosophy, potentially with some unnerving fantasies of their own. Some who use the darknet or the deep web and frequent chans do so deliberately because of their political beliefs of being in an unregulated space where one can maintain anonymity. Some use online currency like Bitcoin precisely because of their libertarian ideals concerning the free market and no legal framework. Nevertheless, the fact is that in those spaces they are only 1 or 2 clicks away from images of child porn. The easy availability of such images gives online libertarians much more exposure than the real-world libertarians of yesterday. This exposure, in my opinion, can create a much more blasé attitude towards images of that type, or any other. It becomes obvious or logical to many that clicking on an image should not be considered a crime. So why is it that at least some of the very same people who have these beliefs took part in the campaign against Sarah Nyberg? Could the explanation really be so juvenile as being due to her opposition to Gamergate? Could the explanation be partly explained by her being a trans person? A group which Milo stated that he and the right had lost the public battle for hearts and minds against. Whichever way you look at it, the hate campaign against Nyberg, which went on for many months, looks both dishonest and stunningly hypocritical. Speaking of dishonesty and hypocrisy, let us return to Yiannopoulos.
Why paedophiles can get away with this stuff and why progressives and liberals back them.
You think people back pedophiles?
Yes, they do.
Who backs pedophiles?
Well, they make excuses for them.
I've already shown that apologism for paedophilia and child porn is not confined to the left. Not that I necessarily agree with his premise at all. But let's tackle making excuses for paedophiles.
Who is Father Michael?
I'm not. No, I bet.
Is a real dude.
I shouldn't
maybe suck his dick for real.
Don't make me. I was quite enthusiastic about it. I thought my English teacher too. I wasn't
Drag
abused
queen?
as a child or anything like that.
Just
really
a fucking creep getting his dick sucked. Then
he's gonna get lynched now.
Touching as it is, if you pardon the pun, that Milo shows concern for a paedophile priest who might get lynched, it seems slightly odd that he led a lynch mob against somebody who may have looked at child porn or taken a photo of his cousin. Not to mention the complete absence of awareness of how this priest may have abused hundreds of other children.
What's his name?
Well, I'm not saying anymore.
Well, how old were you at the time? You were a little kid, and he was like what?
You're trying to.
Was he in his 20s or 30s?
Yet another feminist strategy that you have adopted.
It's a witch hunt.
I told you it wasn't the pedophilia. I was after I lost my virginity. I was in my teens. I was in my teens.
14.
I was in my teens. Something like that.
So there it is. The precocious 13 or 14-year-old child instigated, and the poor priest couldn't resist the homosexual boy Lothario. And in a strange turn of events, feminists are somehow to blame because they condemn child abuse? An interesting case of doublethink, methinks. Feminists and the left support child abuse, and are against it at the same time. But surely anybody so concerned with paedophilia to write passionate articles about the alleged sins of Nyberg viewing images wouldn't tolerate real-life paedophilia with young children other than himself. I mean, if such a caring individual ever witnessed suspected paedophilia, they would immediately object or report abuse to the authorities, right? And even if for some reason they didn't do that, a journalist would at least write an article or leak information about said paedophiles. Yeah?
In Hollywood, I went to their boat parties and to their house parties and things, and some of the things I have seen have beggared belief. I don't want to be indiscreet about specific people.
Right.
I mean, some of the boys there were very young. Very young.
And this is really recently?
I don't remember. No, like, I don't know, 8 years ago.
Because it takes a man of high principle who really cares about children to not inform the authorities of real-life cases of sexual abuse, and to continue to protect the identities of those adults who are having sex with very young boys.
Sure, as I say, and there were some very young boys around at that time. There was a lot of drugs and a lot of...
twinks.
A lot of twinks taking drugs and having unsafe sex with older men, and some of these boys were very young.
If Milo thinks 12 is an acceptable age for him to have sex with an adult, I shudder at the thought of how old very young is in his opinion. This is utterly repugnant from somebody that deigns to impart his wisdom of a suspected minor offence and yet did absolutely nothing when child abuse was occurring in front of him. And so there it is, in its full glory. The Nyberg campaign was led by a man who covers for paedophile priests and Hollywood paedophiles and thinks it's okay for at least some underage teenagers to have sex with adults. And at least some, although I would guess that most, that took part, privately believe the consumption of child porn is okay. Not a soul who took part in the campaign who watched the podcast expressed concern about child molesting priests and teachers. Not a whisper about the children at boat parties who were being abused and plied with drugs as Milo looked on. Because talking about alleged fantasies online and taking a photo is far worse than adults having sex with children in real life, right? The man that allowed himself to be used as the figurehead in this witch hunt and the former de facto leader of Gamergate, Sargon of Akkad, should be ashamed to have taken part in this vicious and utterly unprincipled charade. He knew full well that Nyberg would be the target of abuse and harassment as a result. And for what result? Nyberg has not been charged with any crime. Other than helping to promote Milo's career and keeping Gamergate together for a few more weeks, what was achieved? With the exception of a further stain on Sargon's reputation, absolutely nothing. Yep, a good old witch hunt will really push back those evil SJWs, won't it? The double standards are glaringly obvious. You fool absolutely nobody. Was this about paedophilia, or was this about weaponizing abused children to point score against SJWs?
But the problem with outrage culture is that because these people are all basically quite thick, they tend to move in herds. And so outrage culture can have trends, you know? Mm-hmm. And so people can sort of cotton on to a particular idea, and suddenly everybody's outraged about the same thing.